Hello folks, I'm Rob Whitman and I wish I could be there with you today at the Army Distributed Learning Conference. It really is a great opportunity though for me to talk to you a little bit about some of the issues that are out there in front of us today. And as each of you know, this is a critical time for our men and women in uniform in this nation, as we have a number of engagements around the world. As you know, we're engaged in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now recently Libya. Those create a number of issues for us, especially for our military, and we want to make sure that we are properly addressing those issues. And recently, the House Armed Services Committee has adopted the National Defense Authorization Act, and that's really the blueprint for what we do in all of our service branches and what we do in making appropriations decisions. This framework that happens under the National Defense Authorization Act lays out how spending takes place and how we prepare this nation for all of the efforts that we have to pursue in the future to make sure we provide for this nation's defense. And the National Defense Authorization Act this year, I think, did a number of significant things to preserve the integrity of our military, and also, I think, the integrity of this nation to be able to provide those critical areas of defense in all of our service branches going forward. We looked at some significant weapon systems, whether we should be continuing down the road with those. Lots of debate about a second engine or alternative engine for our F-35, the new Joint Strike Force fighter. Also, they're on the shipbuilding side to make sure that we have a clear path to build ships for the future, whether they're nuclear aircraft carriers, whether they're attack submarines, and specifically our ballistic missile defense submarines. Those are going to be very critical as the Ohio-class submarines age out. We have to come up with how we build that next generation of SSBN submarines, or what is termed SSBN-X. There's a fairly expensive boat, so we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to determine where those dollars are coming from. So the National Defense Authorization Act lays those elements out. Also, for the Army, making sure we consider the weapon systems that are needed for the future. As we know, the Future Combat Systems, that particular program has been contracted somewhat. We need to look at different vehicles that serve the Army's needs into the future. So this bill lays out some of those elements in the future, where the plans are going, how we can make sure that we meet, again, this nation's defense needs. We talk about the Marine Corps, the joint efforts there that the Marine Corps has with other branches, and also their need for an expeditionary fighting vehicle. They have a vehicle right now that's nearing 45 years old. They need a new generation of vehicle. We have to look at, though, how do we make sure those needs are met, but within a fairly challenging budget time. So those are some of the issues that we've been addressing there in the National Defense Authorization Act, making sure that we are thoughtful about where the dollars come from, looking too at future compensation for our men and women in uniform. I think it's critical that we keep in mind paying a competitive salary for our men and women in uniform, and especially for what we're asking them to do these days. So that's part of this, as well as what we're doing in the future for our veterans and the cost that they have for things like TRICARE for Life. Also recently, as chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, we've had a number of very, very active hearings and briefings lately. First of all, in the policy that we are undertaking concerning detainees. What are we doing with those detainees, whether it's in Guantanamo Bay or whether it's in Afghanistan? So we have really been trying to determine the best course of action there, what's the best policy. And the National Defense Authorization Act put many of those policies together as to how we deal with detainees, whether we send them back to countries. The concern is do those detainees return back to the battlefield? That's been a deep concern for me, as we see many of those detainees, especially in Yemen, ones that we have sent to Saudi Arabia, have ended up back in Yemen in the battle space, and specifically as leaders in Al-Qaeda. We've seen some of the same things happening there in Afghanistan for those that have been returned to Pakistan. So we need to be thinking very carefully about our detainee policies and what we're doing in considering whether or not to release detainees we currently have at Guantanamo Bay, and assuring ourselves as much as possible they don't return to the battlefield and again pursue our forces and wreak harm on our forces. We know that a number of our folks, unfortunately, have been affected by those detainees returning to the battlefield. In fact, we've suffered casualties because of those detainees returning to the battlefield. That's even more incumbent upon us then to make sure we have good policies in considering what do we do in even considering releasing those detainees. What do we do in continuing to detain those detainees there at Guantanamo and even in Afghanistan as we, in the years to come, ramp down our presence there in Afghanistan. Another big focus for me has been Arlington National Cemetery. As I'm sure many of you have read or have heard on television and radio, there's been a significant amount of mismanagement there at Arlington. I am deeply concerned about the identification of remains, about record-keeping systems there that have just been absolutely mismanaged, that they have not done the things that they need to do to keep in mind that everybody needs assurance. They need certainty about not only the placement of the remains there, but also the identification of remains. We've seen a number of instances where headstones are not placed on the proper location where remains are located, where we've had remains that unfortunately have been mistreated, have been actually disposed of, have been misidentified. There are so many different issues there about how that cemetery, where our nation's heroes are interred, how it's been run. I want to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to hold everybody there at the cemetery accountable, as well as making sure that the Army does what they need to do. We've had great conversations with Secretary McHugh, and he's assured us that things are going to be happening there to make sure that there is no question, that there's no uncertainty about the identification of remains, the placement of remains, and the identification on the headstone there. We want to make sure that those things happen just as he says they're going to happen, and we're going to make sure we continue to push the issue, hold the Secretary accountable for what he says he is going to do, and to be brutally honest, Arlington Cemetery is not there yet. There are a number of shortcomings. We've continued to look at what's happened there. In fact, just a couple of days before the hearing we had on the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, we saw, just those couple of days before, 8 sets of remains come out of an unmarked grave without identification, and that is absolutely unacceptable. We also had a retired Air Force colonel come before us and testify. He went there to Arlington to visit his wife, who was interred there 4 years earlier. He had been going there on an annual basis, came there to honor his wife, to there kneel at her grave, to put flowers on her grave. And when he heard of the mismanagement and the problems there at Arlington, he called Arlington and he asked, I want to make sure, is my wife where the headstone marks her place? And he was assured by the folks there that she was exactly where the headstone said she was. Unfortunately, he got a call about a month later saying, we are not sure that she is there. And come to find out, she wasn't there. And as you can imagine, here we are, a retired Air Force colonel, now had been going to a gravesite where he thought his wife was interred, and she wasn't. I mean, imagine how disturbing that would be to you. And then, in the effort to fix that, what happened was they exhumed her remains, replaced her in another gravesite with the headstone there. Unfortunately, the colonel didn't get invited to that reinterment. And you would think that that would happen. I would think that that would be the right thing to do. So those things are very, very concerning. When I asked the colonel, I said, how certain are you that your wife's remains are now where the headstone states she is interred? He said 98% sure. You know, folks, that should never be acceptable. 100% certainty is what's acceptable there at Arlington. We need to abide by the highest standards of remains identification and make sure that that cemetery is managed based on the highest standards anywhere. We owe that to our nation's heroes. That has to happen. Our committee is going to continue to pursue this issue to make sure that it happens. You know, I appreciate, again, the opportunity to speak with you today. Your conference really is critical in promoting the use of distributed learning. What you all are doing to make sure that learning takes place in a very efficient and flexible manner for our armed forces is critical. We know today that training is an integral part of making sure that our forces are up to date on everything that they might face in the field, and we know that they operate in a very, very dynamic environment today. And as I've had the opportunity to travel downrange and visit with our men and women in uniform, I'm able to learn their needs, what they need to learn to make sure that they can keep up with what changes on the battlefield. also to make sure that they can keep up with what changes back here stateside, with what changes within how our military operates, and what you all do to make sure that people get that up-to-date training, whether it's from things like acquisition or whether it's on things such as tactical operations. All those elements for our armed forces are absolutely critical to make sure that you all are doing those things necessary to make sure our forces are trained properly and that they have up-to-date information at their fingertips to make sure that they are doing what's necessary to defend this nation. And absolutely they do a fantastic job, and I think that's a reflection of a total effort. Your effort in there is critical to make sure that they have that training to perform at the highest levels. So I appreciate that and what you all bring to the table there and making sure that we have the best training in a standardized way that meets the needs of our men and women in uniform, and make sure that our war fighters have exactly what they need at their fingertips. So folks, I thank you again for having the opportunity to say a few words for you today. I hope that your seminar there goes well. I really appreciate what you do in service to this nation. I cannot thank you enough for your dedication to this nation and what you do in the total effort throughout our armed forces to make sure that this nation remains the great nation it is today and that we can enjoy the liberties and freedoms that we all hold dear. So again, thank you very much. May God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.